All right.
Well, everyone, welcome back to a very exciting episode of your Storybox podcast. Today, my friends, I'm delighted to welcome someone who I have been challenged by and really, really impacted by his work and his writing. His name is Dr. Warren Farrell. Now, for those of you that don't know who he is, you need to get accustomed to his work, especially this book, The Boy Crisis, Why Our Boys Are Struggling and What We Can Do About It. It is highly informative and it's got a lot in here. Some things I knew about, but there was a lot that I didn't know about, and it was great to read it. And like I was just telling Dr. Farrell before, he's a great writer. It's quite easy to actually read. And I know with heavy topics like this, you kind of get stuck sometimes with some of the things that people do write about. But also, Dr. Farrell is the author of many other books as well. His books have been published in more than 50 countries, believe it or not, and in 19 languages. His most recent book, like I said, The Boy Crisis, was co-authored with John Gray, who wrote Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. Many of you would probably know that book as well. But The Boy Crisis was a finalist for the Indie Book Publishing Award. His other books, the New York Times bestseller, Why Men Are the Way They Are. That's a great question. And for a book title too, plus the international bestseller, The Myth of Male Power. And he's got several other books, Women Can't Hear What Men Don't Say. He's got great book titles and the content within them are stellar too. And Why Men Earn More, the startling truth behind the pay gap and what women can do about it. Dr. Farrell, can I welcome you so much to the Storybox podcast today?
I'm looking very forward to talking with you.
Likewise, my friend, likewise. You said to me just a moment ago off air that you're nearing the age of 80 in a few months' time, and I asked you what the secret was. You don't look like you're anywhere near 80. You've got a long life left. So it's great to see that you've still got the energy, and you're also working on another book, I believe. Is that correct?
Yeah, actually, two books, but the one that's coming up is a book called Role Mate to Soulmate. And it's based on 30 years of my doing couples communication workshops around the world. And and I've sort of been able to develop what I think of as an evolutionary shift in the way people are able to communicate. That biologically speaking, we're all programmed to, when we hear criticism, to feel that there's a possible enemy. And so our natural biological response is to defend ourselves against the enemy, or to kill the enemy before the enemy kills us. And so that was wonderful for survival. It's just terrible for love. And so I've been fortunate enough to be able to, after many years of working on it, to find a way around that natural propensity to feel defensive in response to criticism. And I have the Role Mate to Soulmate course up on my website, but I wanted to go deeper into it and make it into book form. And so that's what I'm working on right now.
Well, that sounds very, very exciting. I'd have to have you back on at a later date to discuss all that. But today, my friend, it is about your current book that is out, The Boy Crisis, which I think is a very, very prevalent issue in society today, and what's going on with it. Before we dive further into, I guess, the research and what's going on, I did want to ask you this important distinction. What is the difference between a boy versus a man?
Basically, it's sort of the obvious difference and except for there's a very important one also. When it comes to moms, many moms are very protective of boys. But moms, in the process of seeking out a father to be, are often seeking out someone who can protect them.
Yeah.
So there's oftentimes not a great openness on the part of women to men talking about their problems, because biologically women were trained to sort of find a protector, find a provider. And somebody that complains about something that's bothering them sort of does not feel like a protector. A protector keeps his mouth shut and protects you. Whereas when you talk about men or men's issues, it's like for many women, even though they want to feel empathetic on a sort of deep, visceral level. A man talking about what's bothering him feels a lot like nails scratching on a chalkboard. Yeah. And it just doesn't feel right. Whereas talking about something that bothers her son taps into her protective instinct. And she doesn't say to herself, I can't hear that my son is having a fear of calling Krista because he thinks Krista is too attractive and Krista will never, and he's afraid of rejection. Well, suddenly she can understand her son's fear of rejection, whereas she wouldn't have wanted to necessarily hear from her husband or a man, "Oh, I'm really afraid to ask women out. I'm afraid of rejection." That would have felt too whiny and not a symbol of a type of man that I want to be, have at least the option of being a provider and protector.
So the main differences are there's biological aspects as well as there's a maturity characteristics.
Yes, and obviously maturity, and a boy to a man means when you're a boy, you are asking for protection, you're asking for help, you're learning. When you're a man, you are willing to help others, take responsibility, fulfill obligations. Those are part of that. But in order to become a man, you have to have a great deal of things going right for you as a boy. And one of those things going right for you is to have good boundary enforcement from your parents. Because if your parents enable you to do whatever you want, whenever in any way you want, the end result is you become spoiled, self-centered, lazy, and unmotivated, and you don't feel good about yourself achieving. And when you don't feel good about yourself achieving, you don't get approval from others. And when you don't get approval from others, you end up having low dopamine, and you begin to start becoming depressed and down on yourself. And that leads to video game addiction, sometimes drug or alcohol addiction, and sometimes in the worst case scenario, depression, and the very worst case scenario, suicide or acting out like the mass shooters do.
I don't know whether or not this is a good sort of segue into this, but you do mention ADHD in the book and all the causes as to what happens with someone, a boy that develops ADHD. Would you be able to share, because that also leads on to addiction, doesn't it?
Yes, certainly the two can be related. Oftentimes when a boy has ADHD, aside from certain maybe biological propensities toward it, and being on the Asperger's spectrum, he may, one of the reasons he may have his ADHD reinforced or developed is not having high expectations and always being able to sort of like do what he wants to do when he wants to do it. And as opposed to having the discipline to have to be rewarded when he does something well and have experienced consequences when he doesn't, and have that discipline happen ideally from both the mom and the dad.
You also mentioned that pornography is a large factor, I think, as for boys becoming addicted. And why is pornography such an issue?
Well, pornography is part of the symptom. Usually the pathway to pornography is the boy oftentimes not. So if a boy is learning postponed gratification as a result of boundary enforcement, the outcome of that is that postponed gratification is the single biggest predictor of success or failure. And so as the boy learns that he can't get exactly what he wants when he wants it, but he has to sort of do something like treat his sister well or his brother well that he's roughhousing with before he gets to do more roughhousing. And if he doesn't consider their feelings as opposed to just his own feelings, and he hurts his brother or sister, say in the process of roughhousing, that the father or the mother will say, not just say, you can't do that to your brother or sister, but say, okay, I mentioned to you before that you can't do that to your brother and sister. You had that warning. You did it. Now there's no more roughhousing. And so the boy or the girl begins to feel like, oh, okay, it's not just the consequence of treating my brother or sister badly, when I'm roughhousing, is not just having mom or dad repeat the same thing over and over again. If that's all that's going to happen, I'm going to do what I really want to do, which is push my brother or sister aside to win at the roughhousing. But if I'm going to get the consequence of having no more roughhousing, that's not cool. So I'm going to stay with not treating my brother or sister too rough, so I don't lose the roughhousing. So now that boy or girl is learning, I have to have postponed gratification. My immediate gratification would be to push my brother or sister aside to win at the roughhousing. The postponed gratification is I want the roughhousing in the long run, so I can't do what I want immediately in order to get what I want in the long run. And so when boys and girls learn that, especially boys, because they're more likely to be carried away by the idea of winning at the roughhousing, they will learn more postponed gratification. When they learn postponed gratification at school, when they're doing homework and they get a call to play a new video game or to go out and go to a party, they're more likely to be able to say, no, I need to finish my homework first. And then then maybe I can go to the party, or I can't go to the party. I've got to finish my homework. And so then the boy finishes his homework and he starts getting better grades, and teachers are respectful of him, and they cite him and speak of him positively, or he knows enough to have postponed gratification so he can play basketball or soccer better and be a winner rather than just kick it around a little bit but never be on a team. And so then people start coming to the game and they start respecting him and talking about how good he is at soccer, and the result of that is that the boy starts feeling good about himself, as opposed to he has a dream of making the soccer team, let's say, but he never has enough discipline to make it. And so he sees other boys being complimented or girls being complimented because they're so good at soccer and he's not. And so if he has brothers and sisters and one of them is good at soccer, it can become pretty depressing to hear his parents always talk about how wonderful the brother or the sister is, and never mention his name. That sends many boys without postponed gratification into sort of feeling a little bit depressed about themselves. And then when it comes to male-female attraction time, oftentimes the guy asks a young woman out, and women are interested more in going out with winners than losers. And so she'd rather go out with somebody on the rugby team or the soccer team or the volleyball team or whatever, somebody that stood out, or the student body president, or the ace in school. And so he starts feeling rejected because he's considered by the girls a loser. That oftentimes sends him into depression, or it sends him into pornography, because pornography is access to a variety of attractive women without fear of rejection.
Yeah.
And he's been getting rejection. Pornography is his savior from rejection. But it also addicts him to, first, it desensitizes him to nuances of interactions with women. So instead of being able to pick up on female eye contact and a little bit of withdrawal and body language that is extremely subtle, from that we all do with each other, he's now looking at first a woman becoming naked and then having sex and then having a stranger or more different and challenging types of sex. And then finally, maybe one woman does express an interest in him and gets into the bedroom and sees that he has behaviors that just turn her off. She feels treated like a sex object or a pornography object. And the reason she feels treated that way is because she's being treated that way. But she withdraws from him. Now he's convinced he's worthless. That sends him into more depression. That sends him into more pornography. That sends him into more video game addiction, maybe drug addiction, alcohol addiction, and other things where he's down on himself, and maybe he'll act out and be angry. And very few people understand that anger is a vulnerability's mask. And most people respond to a boy's anger with anger, as opposed to responding to a boy's anger as a sign of vulnerability and responding to that vulnerability with empathy.
Yeah. It's a shame cycle that the boy can get into in a major way. And because pornography is easier than ever these days to access, and because there's no sense of commitment at all to being with this woman, there is no rejection, like you said. It's just easier to find that level of pleasure that you wouldn't get necessarily with a real woman. It's all commodity. Like, it's just at your fingertips nowadays. And yeah, no boy wants to feel rejected at all. Like, they don't want to have to go through that. And it's kind of like shown in movies these days as well, that women want the sort of the broad shouldered dude, the one that looks tough, the jock, so to speak. They don't want the geek, which is just sad, because the geek is usually intelligent and can hold a better conversation than a jock can.
Yes.
And so I understand all those reasons as to what you were just describing, as to why a boy would go down the line of watching pornography and the dangers of pornography with his development as well as his brain. Mm-hmm. So I struggle with pornography since the age of 12, and trying to get rid of that addiction was one of the hardest things I've had to do. And it really, really stuffed me up. It stuffed up my relationships. It stuffed up the way I saw myself. I ended up with that shame cycle, as you said, or as I said, sorry, before, as well as depression, anxiety, you name it. And I felt worthless. I didn't feel like a real man at the end of the day, which is interesting, because you sort of, in the moment, you kind of feel like one when you're watching, because it's sort of convincing you that you're with this woman, or you think that you want to be with this woman. And there's like so many options available to you. Does that all make sense?
Oh, absolutely. And it's exactly what happens. And it's really why, set aside the moral aspects of pornography for a moment. It is a drug, and it's meant, and it's formed as a drug. And, our beautiful women are a drug for men. But beautiful women in real life form come with enormous complexity, which is the bad news and the good news. The bad news is that it's enormous complexity, and it can be very challenging for a man whose emotional growth cycle is usually slower than a woman's, and especially the type of man who is, if he's focused on his body and he's a sports player and so on, he's not always as focused on nuances and emotional intelligence. And so, for him in particular, that can be very challenging, and he may, but if he's good looking jock, then he usually has access to women, even if he's not highly sophisticated on an emotional level. But for men who are sophisticated at emotional level at the beginning, and then begin to get involved with pornography, that sophistication begins to he loves it that he doesn't have to get rejected in order to have access to the beautiful woman, in order to be able to have an orgasm. But at the same time, he becomes more and more disconnected from the thousands of nuances that create an interpersonal relationship, that make it in the long run so much more fulfilling for a man than for a woman. For a man that does when he's not that way.
Which is also interesting, because the man goes to pornography for that sense of connection, but then they're actually being disconnected entirely from reality. Yes. So it's kind of like an escape mechanism as well.
And it just increases his likelihood of getting rejected as his expectations become. So when you've been desensitized and desensitized and desensitized in the way that you feel like, you can really get off is, a woman maybe receiving your ejaculation in her face, and the woman goes, I have no interest in doing that. But if that's the way you've learned to be turned on, then there's such a gap between what creates dopamine for you and what creates an interest on her part. And that is and then that sends that boy into just the shame cycle, the depression cycle, I'm worthless cycle, and feeling more and more fearful. I mean, it's already And there's an enormous bias in the culture of discrimination against men in the culture. And that discrimination is that when we learn, when we learn about sex at an early age, we feel that there's an enormous desire on our part for women's physical bodies that is not matched to the same degree on the part of women toward the average man. Women might have a really strong attraction to an extremely good-looking man. That might be 1 or 2 or 3% of the male population. But males, we look around our 11th grade classroom and we'd enjoy having sex with any one of about 60% of the females in the class, as opposed to the women who would enjoy having sex with any one of maybe 5% of the males in the class. So there's that gap. The second gap is that there's that we are telling women and men all about the negatives about sex and sexuality, and to be careful about STDs and everything else like that, and make sure you use prophylactics, and this could happen, that could happen, all the dangers and the negatives. And we still use, when we use the F word, that should be something that's a loving word, but instead it's a swear word. And so we say sex is dirty at the same time, and then with all that sex is dirty message, we still say to girls, girls, it's fine for you to initiate the sex if you wish to, but it's not an expectation. It's an option. So for young girls and young women, risking sexual rejection is an option. But for young boys and young men, it's an expectation. And that gap between option and expectation means that men are far more fearful of rejection much more frequently than women are. And so therefore turning to pornography so that the man doesn't have to experience that rejection is a much greater temptation, even above and beyond the greater attraction of men to women's bodies and vice versa.
It's a huge disappointment when the man's fantasies aren't sort of realized by the woman, because it's like not based in reality at all. And if you haven't spoken to your partner about what you would like to happen, and if they reject that notion entirely, then once again, you feel disappointed. So you're like, well, what's the point of this? I'm with someone at the moment that doesn't want to give me something that I desire, and yet I'm more than willing to give something to the female that she wants or she desires. So what's going on? Kind of thing. But also we've made society like this hookup culture. Have you noticed any problems with that regarding our males?
Well, I mean, it's problematic, and it's partially a solution and partially a problem. The good news is when I grew up, there was when I grew up, there was no sex before marriage, was the rule. Now, most people had sex before marriage, but they had to keep it secret, and the woman was ashamed, and she was worried that, if she did break up with the person, that guy might tell somebody else, and it would get around, or he would brag about it in the locker room, and she would be considered a slut, and so all those types of things were in our culture when I grew up, and it's and hookup culture, as damaging as it can be, does have some advantages over the first time you have sex with a woman. It should be after you're married, and if you have sex with her before then, it's a shame. Or if you have sex with her before then because you really wanted sex, but you didn't really want marriage, you then have to sort of lie or manipulate your way out of the marriage. And then if you do that a few times, you get a reputation for doing that. And so, it's always been a challenge, one way or the other. But the hookup, and for a while there was something, excuse me, in the late 60s and 70s and 80s, there was a sexual revolution, and women were much more open sexually. And so you saw women who, a year before, wouldn't have sex before they were married. And then 2 years later, married women and unmarried women would have an open marriage or sexuality or group sex or things like that they would never have thought about or would have been ashamed if they, or looked down upon it, someone else that had these things. And so we are enormously influenced by what the society allows. And then as time went on and women began to sense, and I remember magazines and articles in Ms. Magazine, which was a feminist publication, saying that, we are, the sexual revolution, we're giving our sex away for free, if you will. And when we could in fact have leverage for that, for that sexuality. So, we're sort of like losing our power here. And so we began, the sexual revolution closed down, to a large degree. But then eventually, with technology, hookup culture, increased and became more viable. But now we're seeing again a reverse of that. We're seeing that men and women are having much less sex, now on average, even though some people are hooking up, the average person doesn't have sex, as early as they did or as frequently as they did about 10 years ago.
And you also talk about in the book, the rate of men's sperm count or boys' sperm count has significantly reduced. Why is
yes,
that?
That's another issue, which is that, so larger picture first. What got me into writing the Boy Crisis book, and really I initially started out, speaking, I was on the board of directors of the National Organization for Women in New York City. I was the world's leading male feminist for a number of years. And I began to, as I was speaking on some of my books, and I remember speaking in Japan, and a woman in Japan came up to me afterwards and said, Dr. Farrell, I have more problems with the boys in my class than I do with the girls in my class. And so I said, oh, interesting. And as I began to hear that in Australia and Canada and UK, I began to start tuning in to the fact that it's maybe not just girls and women that are having problems, but also boys and men. So that went on my radar maybe 40, 50 years ago. And then I began to see more and more data to support that. Eventually, when I started doing the research for the Boy Crisis, I found that in all 56 of the largest developed nations, boys were falling behind girls on every single academic area, but especially in reading and writing. And reading and writing are the two biggest academic predictors of success or failure. Postponed gratification is the biggest predictor of life success or failure. Yep. Reading and writing is the biggest predictor of academic success and failure. And so so boys were falling behind in all these areas. And I began to start saying, well, I wonder what that's about. And I began to investigate what that was about. But it also just alerted me to boys falling behind. And then I began to see that boys were falling behind also emotionally, and psychologically and mental health wise. So, for example, at the age of 9, boys and girls commit suicide about equally, and very rarely. But by between age 10 and 14, boys commit suicide at twice the rate of girls. Mm. Between the ages of 15 and 19, boys commit suicide at 4 times the rate of girls. And between the ages of 20 and 25, boys commit suicide about 5 times the rate of girls. Now that's pretty common and about the same ratio in the US, Australia, Canada, and UK, and much of Europe. And so I started asking myself, why is that? Boys are supposedly as boys grow into men, they're supposedly more and more aware of all the advantages that they have. But if they are aware of all these advantages, and that's the only thing they're aware of, why are they committing suicide more? And then I started, and, people would say, well, that's, they'd have their reasons for it. Like, well, girls attempt suicide more. And as I started looking I did more research for the Boy Crisis and started seeing that, wait a minute, what's the difference between attempting suicide and committing suicide? And I was able to develop 63 red flags of depression and suicide that differentiated between attempting and committing suicide as part of that. So, for example, when a girl attempts suicide more frequently than boys on average, which is true, the girl is sending out a signal. She's sending out a signal saying, I believe that there are people in my life who do care, who, if they hear about the fact that I'm in deep trouble, will take me off the back burner of their life and bring me to the front burner and pay attention to me and hear me out and support me.
Yeah.
Whereas committing suicide happens when you feel that no one loves you.
Yeah. Hopelessness.
No one needs you. There's no hope of that changing.
Yeah.
If there's someone who does respect you a lot and you talk to them about the fact that you're feeling all this fear and you wish to commit suicide, they may help you, but they'll lose respect for you. Yeah. And those are just 4 out of 63 red flags of depression or suicide that males are much more likely to experience that lead them to committing suicide, as opposed to doing what girls do, which is attempting suicide, as sad as it is part of the solution. That is, the girl is saying, I need help. She's calling out for help. Yeah. That's a good thing, even though it shouldn't be done, have to be done on the level of attempting suicide. And you see this in college. So in colleges, 75% of the people who report to psychologists on college campuses, 75% of them, report to psychologists about suicidal ideations that they have. 75% of the suicidal ideation reports are from females. But 75% of the people in college who commit suicide are males.
Yeah.
Which gives you a sense that the reporting of it, is part of the solution, whereas part of the male problem is feeling that we can't even admit it to ourselves, no less to other people.
I mean, can you really stop a male from committing suicide if he actually really wants to do it?
Well, it depends on the level of want. But the answer is, there's 3 answers to that question. And that is yes, yes, and yes.
Yeah.
If, you can't stop him, by putting him in, but what you can do is to talk to him, is to be there for him unconditionally, to get him, to help to find a support system from him, with him, to discover the things that he's doing well, that he's good at, that he's successful at, to honor him, help him find purpose. Very rarely does a boy who has purpose, or a boy who feels like that people really love him, and they love him not for the face or the pretense he's putting on, but they love him despite the fact that he's addicted to pornography, or despite the fact that he has revealed 4 or 5 things. Maybe he cheated on a test. Maybe he had sex with a woman without a condom, when he didn't, only sort of quasi persuaded her into it, and he feels ashamed about that. But he's able to talk about these things that he feels ashamed about to somebody that he doesn't feel withdraws from him because he is sharing these things. Now, this, in the Boy Crisis book, I talk about a lot of ways of helping boys to not commit suicide if they're on that path. The good news is there are a lot of ways, and the bad news is it's never 100%.
Are other men responsible for making our boys and our other men feel like they're low, like they don't have a sense of purpose, like there is no hope? Are they responsible as well? No one is really responsible for someone else's personal decisions. Yeah.
Ultimately, you always, being a man or really a good woman, a woman as opposed to a girl, or a man as opposed to a boy, is taking responsibility for your own behavior and not putting it on somebody else. And to look at any repetitive behavior that you have in your life. And if any behavior is repetitive, saying to yourself, it's repetitive. This is probably, very possibly, not a mistake because the common denominator of repetitive behavior is me. Yeah. So what can I do differently so I don't repeat that behavior in the future?
So really there's no fault. There's no one really to blame at all for this crisis?
No, I mean, short of if you're a bully and you beat somebody up and you demean them and so on, taking that type of negative thing or, constantly demeaning somebody and getting a group of people to demean that person, yes, you can begin to take some responsibility. But overall, if I'm talking to the person who is wishing to blame someone else, I always ask them to take responsibility. If I'm looking at somebody who is doing something like bullying or whatever, I ask them to look at themselves and whether that's really what they want to be doing with their life is hurting other people.
How does one go about studying something like the boy crisis and actually figuring out that we do have a major problem?
Well, first, I think you have to get your own act together. Make sure that you're reasonably, that you do have postponed gratification, that you are doing positive things with your life, and you're not having severe mental health problems. Yeah. Once you have that reasonably intact, you're going to say two things to yourself. One is that just first of all, read through the boy crisis from beginning to end and see what you are inspired by. See what would give you a sense of purpose if you could improve that problem. So maybe you see in the boy crisis that Cub Scouts or Boy Scouts are really very helpful for boys. Or you see that what I call the liberal arts of sports, team sports, pickup team sports, and self-starting sports like tennis or gymnastics, that maybe they are really in combination really good for kids. Maybe that as a teacher you're a male, and that even though teaching might earn less, you could get enormous amounts of fulfillment out of teaching in a way that helps boys learn. So you're inspired to become a teacher. So look for an inspiration as you read the boy crisis. And that inspiration, the purpose of looking for that inspiration is that people who have purpose, who feel that they're contributing, almost never commit suicide. That's one of the best antidotes. Plus, they tend to make other people feel proud of them, impressed with them. So it works at every level. You are doing some good for somebody, and the good news and the bad news together is that when you think of boys and men's issues, you're not automatically seen as being a hero because you are if you when I spoke around the world on women's issues, I was seen as a hero, and the most frequent comment I got was, "How can we clone you?" But once I started speaking on boys and men's issues, I have never once gotten that question from a woman. Occasionally I've gotten it from a man, but very rarely. And so it's been like, I had to deal with the fact that I would lose somewhere between $10 and $25 million over the course of my lifetime if I started speaking on boys and men's issues. I would lose almost all my feminist friends. I would lose, I would not be as respected, and my parents would start, thinking, gee, you're making a lot less money than you used to. You're not as on TV as often as you used to be. What's happening here? Why are you defending men? They have all the power. That they don't need your defense or your understanding or your compassion. And so so you have to have the courage to not just want to be popular. You have to have the courage to read it, discover what really can be helpful to boys, men, and therefore girls and women, because no woman wants a loser man, and especially a woman who's looking for a future father. She's not looking in parents' basements for kids living with their parents. She's not looking in unemployment lines. She's a college graduate. She's not looking for college dropouts, and certainly not high school dropouts. And so when we're all in the same family boat, And when only one sex wins, both sexes lose.
Yeah.
And for the past half century, we've focused on only women winning. And as a result, both sexes have lost.
It's like the whole feminist movement was all about overtaking men. It was all about subduing men in a large degree. And it's interesting how you were a male feminist, you're supporting women, and I guess supporting this whole idea. But then now that you're speaking out about, well, there's now a crisis with our boys because I think we've gone a little bit too far. It just seems like, well, no, you can't do that because men are the problem. Men are the issue.
Yes. I 100% always have and always will support women growing and women being whoever they want to be, and women being able to have children and not have children, and the freedom of women to make many choices. I love it that women are involved in sports to a much greater degree than they were when I was growing up. I think that's benefited women enormously and benefited the men that are with those women enormously. However, the feminist movement has to a large degree moved from the old Helen Reddy song, "I am woman, I am strong," to "I am woman, I've been wronged." And competing to be the biggest victim does not increase people's respect for women. No. It only increases people's fear of women. And fear may lead to more employers hiring women because they're afraid of losing contracts if they don't. Fear may be a way of getting those employers to promote equal numbers of women because they're afraid they will lose contracts if they don't, or they'll be condemned if they don't. But it is not a way of genuinely respecting women, which would be to earn that employment and earn that promotion based on the company's need to make more money or to do better, and seeing that women are going to help that company do better rather than artificial promotions. Capitalism has an incentive to not discriminate. When capitalism does discriminate, it pays the price by paying more money to hire less competent people. That's the price that capitalism pays when it doesn't see women's value.
I mean, I do
or men's value, right?
Yeah, exactly right. I mean, I do have a lot of respect for women. I mean, what would we do without women? I mean, women are incredibly strong, they're powerful, and they're very resourceful as well. There's a lot of intelligent women that I know. My mum was responsible for raising me in a large degree and disciplining me in a large degree. But I also realized the importance of men as well. Like, what will we do without men? We need men to teach our boys how to be men. But when women take over and say, no, you can't, you're basically emasculating the boy. They can't reach that pinnacle of them feeling like they're a man. And so we have these whole issues of them staying at home, failure to launch. We have the economic issues as well. Then we have this whole spiral of out of control, feeling like I can't get married because why should I? Or there's these other issues that come as a result of all this. So it's interesting.
I'll do a little visualization with you on that issue for a moment. If you're listening to this, and particularly if you're a woman, I'll ask you to just visualize the home you live in, and then think about that home, how it got built, how the lumberjacks cut down wood, and they're one of the most hazardous professions. More than about 95% of the people who die as lumberjacks are males. Or severely injured. And yet those lumberjacks cut down the wood, and then that wood was cut more precisely, eventually put into lumber yards and trucked to somewhere near your community by long distance truckers who oftentimes worked late at night and had a very high percentage of accidents. It's also one of the hazardous professions. And those truckers were almost all males. the long distance truckers, the construction workers. In the United States, one construction worker dies every workday hour. And so the construction workers are the ones that, not the ones that stop the traffic while you're on the construction site, but the ones that are up on top of the roofs and doing the welding, doing the taking the dangerous jobs up there on the rafters. They're well over 95% males, and they die at they're also one of the hazardous professions. So your home was built, the lumber was cut down, the lumber was trucked to you. Your home, every part of it was built probably almost completely by males that risked their lives doing that or risked injuries doing that. And then just think of yourself as going into that home and flushing the toilet. The sewers were built almost completely by males. They're cleaned almost completely by males. Turn on the lights. Your lighting was invented largely by males, and the electricity was provided, and so on. You can go on and on about the different aspects of our life that are convenient for us, that make us live period, and live comfortably, and realize that men do make a contribution, as opposed to sometimes when I talk to feminist friends about this, they'll be dismissive and sarcastic about, are males really worth anything? And they'll go immediately to the shadow side of masculinity, which is a lot. Certainly the serial killers, the murderers, the people in prison, they're largely males also. But we have forgotten in the last years about the other side of that. The second huge mistake of feminism, and this will be really powerful for you if you're listening, you hear or watching, you hear this. I'll ask you to close your eyes for a moment and imagine with me your dad when he was younger, and see if you can guess what might have been a glint in your dad's eye that he had when he was younger. Do you think that was there any hint that he might have wanted to be a singer? Did he sing in a chorus in the church, for example? Was there any hint that he might have wanted to be a writer? Did he love writing poems or messages to your mom? Or let you know that he had interest in being a writer in another way? At any point in his life, did he ever play an instrument? And do you think that he wanted to be maybe a musician? Do you think that did he ever act in school? Did you ever ask him if he acted in school plays? And did he ever have an aspiration or a fantasy of being an actor? Does maybe a hint can come from maybe he loves telling jokes or stories, and he maybe tells them over and over again, so you roll your eyes at, oh boy, I've heard this story before. But your dad always knew he got a laugh out of it, and he got attention for a few moments while he told it. Maybe that's a clue that he had a glint in his eye of wanting to be an actor. Maybe your dad was at one point an elementary school teacher. And when you were born, your mom and your dad, imagine them getting together and saying, will you be able, if we have this child called you, and plus as many brothers or sisters as you had, if we have this many children, as an actor, a musician, as a writer, are you going to be called starving artist? Or if you're an actor, will you be called waiter? Or as a musician, will you not be able to put enough gigs together to make it? As an elementary school teacher, if you love teaching, but you realized when you had children that you couldn't teach and really provide enough of an income to be able, with mom working, with mom being home with the children more, that you wouldn't be able to provide enough income to move into a good school district, with a good school, with a nice home, with enough room for your children, with the right type of neighborhood influence. And so therefore, you couldn't remain an elementary school teacher or a musician. You had to give up that glint in your eye and do something you liked less, that earned more. If you don't think that your dad is still alive and you don't know what that glint in the eye is, Dad, ask him. And if you're not sure and he's not alive, imagine what it might be. And as you ask him, the chances are fairly good you'll discover that there was some passion that he had, but he might be hesitant to talk to you about it at first, because that's not the way men think about what's my passion. Traditional men think about what's my obligation, what's my responsibility, not what's my passion. And so when you were born and your brothers and sisters were born, men just learned to give up that passion if it didn't look like it was going to lead to them producing enough money to be able to give you opportunities that they never had, and to give the mom security that she and a good home and a good neighborhood as well. Now here's the key. When Dad gave up that job to earn more money, we as feminists looked at the fact that he earned more money and called that male power and male privilege rather than male sacrifice. And as a result of that male sacrifice, many of our fathers started to drink from not liking or feeling fulfilled by their job. They began to be bored. They oftentimes found that when the children were born, the mom was preoccupied with the children more than they cared about focusing on them. And they increasingly felt like a wallet, and that the love of the mom, which used to go to them, now goes almost completely to the children, and making love with him feels like an obligation. If he senses it feels like an obligation to her rather than real passion for her. And therefore he finds himself wanting to be with a prostitute, or wanting to have an affair, or wanting to do something that gives him some sexual satisfaction that makes him feel like somebody is interested. And so if your dad, and what we as feminists did is we took that increased amount of money that men made, and as we called it male power, we began to think of men as part of the patriarchy who made rules to benefit men so that they would make more money for the same work as women, as opposed to recognizing that, yes, it wasn't really men that made more money than women. It was fathers who made more money than mothers. And that when men and women became fathers and mothers, women decreased their focus on work, even if they remained working full time. And 40% of women were fully involved with the children, didn't work at all. In the United States, 40% work full time, but work many fewer hours than they used to. And 20% work part time. And so, and when the women work part time or fewer hours, and there are more obligations with children and so on, the man feels obligated to earn more. And instead of saying, thank you, men, for giving up the glint in your eye and earning more at a job you liked less, that helped the family have a better life and you not have as good a life. Thank you, men, for doing that for us. That type of sentiment I have never heard from a single feminist. And that to me is very sad, because I was a feminist. And if feminism really was about equal compassion for both sexes, I would still call myself a feminist. Or a feminist, or humanist, actually, is what I would call myself.
Yeah, it's just
and that's what I do call myself. So to make that part clear, as I stumbled there for a bit, I am not in favor of a women's movement demeaning men or a men's movement demeaning women. What I am in favor of is a gender liberation movement, freeing both sexes from the rigid roles of the past for more flexible roles for our future.
Yeah. I'm with you on that one. And it's very unfortunate how this sort of society is being sort of created.
Yes.
And because there are distinct differences between males and females. I mean, there's biological differences, but nowadays you've got people saying there's not. So it's confusing the living daylights out of young boys and making it as if like they can't even be the biological sex that they were born in. Like if you say you have a thought that you're somehow not a boy, then you can change and you can be a woman. But that whole line of thinking is just backwards and it's wrong.
It's very, very sad. And the good news and bad news is that every virtue taken to an extreme becomes a vice. And so for many years, many people who were inherently gay or who, might have now today been able to have permission to identify themselves as a sex different than they were born to, they could never even think about that, allow themselves to think about that without being shamed and self-destructive and so on. And today we have a lot more openness to that. That's the good news. The bad news is, that some people can't even call themselves he or she or say I have a daughter or I have a son without being criticized for not being gender fluid or non-binary or whatever. And so once again, we have done, we've taken every virtue and we've taken it to its extreme. So it becomes overplayed. And the good news is that eventually, usually human beings start moving the pendulum back into the center again. But at this point in history, it's not done often. I have to get back to writing the book I'm working on. And so I do need to maybe do one final question or comment.
Of course, yeah. Sorry about that. I was just enjoying the conversation.
I am too, and I suddenly realized that Warren, you got to save us a little bit of energy for finishing off this book you have. You're behind deadline on.
Of course, that's no pressure on me for asking you one final question because I had many more. But the last question that I did want to ask you is, what is the hope for the future of our boys? Is there any hope at all that society and the future for our boys is going to get any better? Are we going to get to a sort of a level playing field, so to speak, where our boys feel confident enough to be men again, to actually get to that stage?
I think the biggest hope is as you go through books on boys, like The Boy Crisis, discover you play a role in making the change for the future. There's hundreds and hundreds of opportunities. There's men's mental health. There's men's physical health. There's the education of boys. There's clarifying the perception that men are the oppressors and women are the oppressed. Clarifying the perception that we live in a patriarchal world where men made the rules to benefit men at the expense of women. Understanding that the world was not dominated by a patriarchy. It was dominated by the need to survive. Yeah. And to survive, neither sex had privileges or rights. Both sexes had obligations and responsibilities. And so instead of only looking at it from the female perspective, look at it from both the female and male perspective. Have the guts to argue it from the female perspective when somebody only argues it from the male perspective, and have the guts to argue it and after you've listened to the male perspective when someone only argues it from that perspective. But there are hundreds of opportunities for you to make the change. And in this area of boys' issues, the opportunities are in every parallel area to all the opportunities that for the past half century we have focused on with women and girls. But for almost each challenge that we've had with women and girls, we have an equal and opposite channel for our sons. If you do that, the next generation will be better because of you.
Well, I personally just want to say thank you so much, Dr. Farrell, for writing a book like this so we can learn and hopefully make a change, hopefully get into the right direction that can help our boys. And I know one day I'm hopefully going to be a father, and I want to raise my kids the right way. If I have a son, then I'm definitely going to make him read this. And then I'll also teach him the right way. But Dr. Farrell, thank you so much for your time today, your wisdom, your advice, your story, everything that you are about. I acknowledge, I just say thank you so much for joining me on the Storybox podcast.
Really been my pleasure. You're very thoughtful. You're a very fine human being to connect with. And thank you for doing your due diligence of reading The Boy Crisis carefully. I appreciate that.